At 81 years old, I sit here on my porch in Virginia, watching the evening mist roll in like memories that refuse to fade. And tonight, my dear friends, I want to tell you something I've hidden for more than 60 years. Something that has burned in my chest like a coal that would not die. My name is Evelyn Hart, and if you ever pass through a little town called Willow Creek, you might see me tending my roses, the ones that won 3 blue ribbons at the county fair. Folks here know me as the quiet widow, with steady hands and the best peach jam in 3 counties. They see my pressed dresses, my polite smile at Sunday service, the way I've waved from my garden when they drive by. But let me ask you, my friends watching right now, do you ever feel like the world only knows your mask? Not your truth? Tell me in the comments. Where are you watching this from tonight? I'd love to know. And if this is your first time on Love and Tears, make sure you hit that subscribe button because tonight's story, it's not easy to hear, but it's one you won't forget. You see, beneath my tidy house and polite manners lies a secret darker than the night sky. A truth so heavy, it would make the good church folks in town cross the street if they knew. For more than 60 years, I've carried it alone. But not anymore. I promised myself this morning when I heard that mockingbird singing outside my window that I would finally tell the real story. Not the version polished and hidden away, but the truth. The truth about what happens when evil wears the face of a husband, and when a girl of 17 is sold to pay her father's debts. Friends, I need you to stay with me through this. Don't turn away when it gets ugly, because this is not just my story, it's the story of silence, of survival, and of how a lie can trap you for a lifetime. It was 1942. Times were harder than old leather. My father was sick with consumption, unable to work the fields. The farm was drowning in debt. And I was 17, young, naive, dreaming of love with a boy named Michael Bennett, the one who used to leave wildflowers on our porch steps. I thought my life would be simple Sunday dinners, children laughing on clean floors, maybe a vegetable garden behind a little white house. But dreams don't pay debts. And one afternoon, at our worn kitchen table, my mother told me about the offer from Arthur Finch, a man 3 times my age, rich, powerful, and looking for a wife after his second one died. I still remember the light through the kitchen window, that day golden and soft, while inside me, the world was shattering. Marriage to Arthur Finch was supposed to mean security. It meant my father might live a little longer. It meant my younger brother could stay in school instead of working the fields until his hands bled. But it also meant burying every dream I'd ever carried in my heart about love. But no one told me what I couldn't have understood until I was already locked inside that house with its suffocating curtains and the strange, sour-sweet smell of wilted flowers, was that Arthur's hunger wasn't love at all. It was something darker, something that still makes my skin crawl even now 60 years later. The wedding itself was small, just family and a few neighbors. Pastor Williams read softly from his old Bible in our front parlor. I wore Mama's dress, altered to fit, and I remember the lace scratching at my neck, almost like it was choking me. Arthur stood there, in his black suit, smelling of bay rum and medicine. And when he slid that golden band onto my finger, His hands were colder than a January morning. That first night, I thought I was ready. Mama had stammered through a talk earlier in the day about a wife's duties, how it might hurt at first, but how it would get easier. But she never prepared me for ritual. For the way Arthur would pull out his pocket watch, like he was timing a race. For the way he folded his clothes neatly, never looking at me, while I slipped into a gown that had belonged to his late wife, Genevieve. The fabric still smelled faintly of her lavender water, 7 times that first day. Morning, mid-morning, noon, afternoon, evening, night, and once again before dawn. Each time the same, silent, methodical. His eyes staring past me, fixed on something I couldn't see. Tell me, friends, could you imagine a hunger like that? Comment below if you've ever known someone who wore a mask of respectability but hid a storm inside. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to Love and Tears so you won't miss the rest of Evelyn's story. I tried to convince myself this was marriage. Maybe older men had different needs, I thought. Maybe this was normal. But the way he gripped my shoulders felt more like punishment than passion. And when he rolled away, dressing quickly, without a word, I'd lie in that bed and listen to the grandfather clock ticking down the minutes until he came again. The other wives in town, when I'd see them after church or at the store, they'd smile knowingly, as if to say, "Ah, newlyweds." But this didn't fade. If anything, his need grew stronger, more desperate, like he was feeding a hole that could never be filled. That's when I began to suspect something horrifying. I wasn't his wife at all. I was something else. A replacement, a shadow, a stand-in for a ghost that wouldn't leave him. Living with Arthur Finch was like living inside a thunderstorm that never broke. The air always heavy, waiting for lightning to strike. He never shouted. He never hit me. To the outside world, he was the perfect provider money for dresses, groceries, Sunday strolls down Main Street. But inside that house, I learned the difference between a husband and a keeper. Arthur's life ran like a train schedule. Wake at 5:30 sharp. Dress in the same exact order every morning. Underwear, undershirt, trousers, shirt suspenders. And then, every single day, he would turn to me with those cold winter eyes and say, just 2 words, "Time, Evelyn," like I wasn't his wife, like I was nothing more than an appointment. The house itself felt like it was holding its breath. Every corner spotless, every piece of furniture polished until it gleamed. Heavy curtains shut out the sun, leaving the rooms dim even at midday. I dusted the same mahogany chairs every morning, polished the same silver frames, their glass holding photographs of strangers, swept floors that never gathered dust. The silence was so heavy, it pressed against my skin. The only sounds, the steady tick of the grandfather clock, and Arthur Finch's measured footsteps as he moved from room to room, like a warden patrolling a prison. Friends, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a place so quiet, so heavy, that it felt like the walls themselves were watching you? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you're just discovering this channel, welcome to Love and Tears. Subscribe now, because stories like Evelyn's are ones you will carry with you long after the video ends. My days became nothing but waiting. waiting for Arthur's voice, summoning me with those two cold words, "Time, Evelyn." Waiting for silent meals, where he buried himself in his agricultural papers. Waiting for nights when the lamp went dark and he turned away from me like I was invisible. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me, not with desire, not even with affection, but with calculation, as though I were being measured against someone in his memory. As if I were failing a test I didn't even know I was taking. I started humming hymns while I worked just to hear a sound. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in the hallway mirror and not recognize the pale, hollow-eyed girl staring back. And then, one autumn afternoon, I found the loose floorboard. It was late October. I remember the maple tree outside had turned the color of dried blood. I'd gone to the upstairs closet, searching for an extra quilt. That's when my fingers brushed against the warped plank. Something about it called to me. Maybe the loneliness, maybe the weight of that house, but I pried it open. Beneath it was a small, hollow space. Inside, a faded blue cloth, smelling of roses and dust. My hands trembled as I unwrapped it. Inside was a leather-bound book, clasped in tarnished brass. When I opened it, I saw the neat handwriting, property of Genevieve Finch, 1940, Arthur's dead wife. I should have put it back. I should have closed it and pretended I never saw it. But I didn't. I sat right there on the closet floor and began to read. At first it was ordinary. Notes about church socials, weather neighborly visits. But as I turned the pages, the tone shifted. Her words grew darker. She wrote of Arthur's peculiar needs, of his punishments disguised as affection, of how he looked at her as though she was someone else, someone who had wronged him. I froze when I read her line. The frequency, it's not natural. It's as if he's trying to erase something through me, using my body to settle a score I don't even understand. Her words could have been my own thoughts. The same fear, the same confusion. And then I reached her last entry. The handwriting shaky, frightened, dated just 3 days before her death. I found the photograph today. I know what he thinks I did. I know he will never forgive me. I'm carrying his child, but he looks at me as though I'm carrying another man's. God help me. I think he means to punish this baby. The words ended there, cut off mid-sentence. I sat frozen, the diary heavy in my hands, Arthur's footsteps echoing below. And in that moment, the truth seared into me. I wasn't Arthur Finch's beloved wife. I was Genevieve's replacement, a stand-in for a revenge that began long before I ever entered that house. And if I didn't uncover what he believed Genevieve had done, I knew I might end up just as dead as she was. That night, I could not sleep. Genevieve's words in that diary circled my mind like vultures. Every time Arthur's breathing slowed into that deep rhythm of sleep, I stared at the ceiling, piecing together the fragments of a nightmare I was only beginning to understand. When the grandfather clock struck 3, I made a decision that would change everything. I slipped from the bed, barefoot, quiet as a shadow, and crept back to the closet. My heart hammered so loud, I thought it might wake the dead. The diary was still there, beneath the loose board. But this time, I didn't hide it again. I carried it down to the kitchen, lit the oil lamp, and opened its final pages. What I read chilled me more than the autumn air. Genevieve had not been imagining things. She had lived the same torment I was living. Only she had uncovered the truth of it before it killed her. The accounts she had written. He's counting the days, convinced the baby inside me was conceived when I was away in Kansas City. But I was faithful, always faithful. The man in the photograph was a stranger, just asking for directions. Yet Arthur believes he has proof of betrayal. Friends, can you feel the horror in those words? If you've ever known someone who twisted innocent moments into false accusations, let me know in the comments. And if you're just joining us, this is Love and Tears. Subscribe now so you never miss stories like Evelyn's stories that cut to the bone. I clutched the diary with trembling hands. The last entry nearly slipped from my fingers. The baby is coming early. Arthur says, if it doesn't look like him, he'll know the truth. God help us both. 3 days later, Genevieve Finch was dead. Dead from childbirth, delivering a child who, town records later showed, looked exactly like Arthur. She had been punished for a sin that never existed. And now I was her replacement, suffering the same punishment for the same imagined crime. The realization struck me like a physical blow. If Arthur had twisted a single photograph of Genevieve speaking to a stranger into evidence of betrayal, what would stop him from doing the same to me? What innocent moment of my past would he seize, untwist and use as proof that I too was unfaithful? And what would happen to me? When he did, I was still sitting there in the kitchen oil lamp, flickering the shadows, moving like restless spirits across the walls. When I heard footsteps on the stairs, they stopped. I could feel Arthur standing there in the darkness, listening. My body went rigid. I blew out the lamp, shoved Genevieve's diary down the front of my nightgown, its leather binding pressing into my ribs. Then his voice came, Evelyn, not loud, not angry, just controlled, cold. The kind of voice that felt sharper than any shout. What are you doing down here? I pressed my back against the kitchen chair, forced my voice steady. Couldn't sleep? I whispered. And in that silence between us, I prayed he couldn't hear the thunder of my heart. That night, I thought a glass of warm milk might help me sleep. But when I turned around, he was standing in the doorway, like a ghost. His white nightgown made Abner look pale, as if he didn't belong to this world. The moonlight drifted through the window, illuminating his cold winter sky eyes, examining every detail of my body. Are you cold? He asked. His tone unreadable, not exactly concerned, more like he was worried about something he had broken than about me. I nodded. I was shivering, but not just from the cold. He moved closer, the smell of rum and antiseptic pungent around me. When his hand touched my cheek, I had to bite my lip to keep from pulling away. You remind me of Genevieve, he whispered. The way you tilt your head walk. It's just like that. The diary pressed against my chest. Felt like it was on fire. They say we look alike, I said softly. Abner nodded, his hand sliding from my cheek to my neck, lingering there, a reminder that he could crush me at any moment. But you're stronger, he continued. She's so weak, she cries all the time. I swallowed back my nausea, pretending to be obedient. He led me back to my room, and I felt as if I were walking past a row of portraits of Finch men with cold faces and eyes like Abner's, and how many women had trembled down that hallway before me. As he lay down beside me, he wrapped his arms around me, holding me close. "You know I love you, right?" The hollow words echoed like a rehearsed script. I could only whisper, "Yes." But deep down, I knew I was living on borrowed time. Sooner or later, Abner would turn the smallest gesture into evidence of betrayal. And then I would die like Genevieve, or find a way to escape before it was too late. The weeks that followed were like walking on broken glass. Every day, I hid the diary in a different place, in a flower box, between mattresses, behind vases, always in fear of Abner discovering it. Because the truth in it was more dangerous than the book itself. Then one Sunday morning in church, I felt the sharp gaze of Mrs. Clara Whitman, the woman who ran the Women's Association. She was known for her sharp tongue and her wit. After the service, she approached, her voice sweet but venomous. "Elizabeth, you look pale these days. It must be hard to live with a man like Mr. Finch, huh?" I smiled awkwardly, but my heart was pounding. Clara continued, "We all know. He had special needs. Poor Margaret, his first wife, was always complaining. And then Genevieve. God bless her. Many times she went to Mass looking like she had just come out of a storm. You're watching Love and Tears. If you're following this story, let us know in the comments. Where are you from? And have you ever heard of such a dark family secret? Don't forget to subscribe to Love and Tears so you don't miss the next part, where even more horrifying truths will be revealed. The other women laughed softly, as if this were nothing more than Sunday gossip. But I felt a frost creeping through my veins. They knew. They all knew what kind of man Abner was. And yet, they had watched in silence while he destroyed 2 wives before me. Of course, Genevieve had her own troubles too. Clara went on leaning closer, as though confiding a holy secret. Toward the end, she was acting peculiar. Paranoid, you might say. Snooping through Abner's belongings, asking odd questions about his first wife, Margaret. Why she even wrote letters to Margaret's family back in Illinois, trying to sniff out what really happened to her. The room seemed to tilt beneath me. Genevieve had been investigating Margaret's death. And here I was, the 3rd wife, following her footsteps into the same dangerous dark. What did she find out? I whispered the words, trembling in my throat. Clara's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Nothing good, honey? Nothing good at all." Her warning clung to me for days after that Sunday service, wrapping around my thoughts like choking ivy. The idea that Genevieve had pried into Margaret's death opened doors in my mind I wanted desperately to keep closed. What if Margaret hadn't simply died in her sleep, as everyone believed? What if Genevieve had uncovered something dreadful about her predecessor's fate? I began noticing things I'd ignored before. How conversations went still when I walked into the general store. How the older women sometimes looked at me with something that wasn't quite pity, but close. How no one ever spoke of Margaret Finch, though she had been gone only 8 years. It was as though the entire town had signed a silent pact to erase her from memory. The knowledge poisoned everything about my life with Abner. When he sat across from me at breakfast, carefully buttering his toast and scanning his agricultural reports, I found myself staring at his hands, wondering what else they had done besides turning soil. When he snapped his pocket watch shut before calling me upstairs, I thought of how that same meticulousness could have been used to chart darker designs. Even his gentleness turned sinister, as if he were handling me with the same care one might give to something they planned to shatter later. But the truth came crashing in when I began searching the house more thoroughly. In the basement behind the coal bin, where no one would ever think to look, I found a trunk pressed against the cold stone wall. The lock was old and rusted, but desperation lent me strength. I pried it open with a fireplace poker, my hands blistering with the effort. Inside lay Margaret's things clothes that reeked of mothballs and faded lavender, delicate gloves yellowed with time jewelry that glittered even in the dim light. Beneath it all, tied with a ribbon nearly crumbling with age, was a bundle of letters. My fingers trembled so violently I could scarcely undo the knot. They were love letters, but not from Abner. They were signed by a man named James, filled with desperate longing and promises to whisk Margaret away from the marriage that had trapped her. The dates marked the final months of her life, each word brimming with urgency. I could almost feel Margaret's ache through the ink, her yearning for freedom, her terror at the cost of taking it. The last letter was different. James was frantic, begging her to leave at once. He wrote that he had heard whispers about Abner's first wife, a woman named Sarah, who'd supposedly died of a fever, but whose death he believed was far from natural. He warned Margaret she must flee before she became another grim entry in the Finch family's history of vanished wives. But Margaret never left. She never ran to James. 2 days after that final letter, she was dead heart failure, they said. 24 years old, strong and healthy, with no ailment in her past, sitting there in that damp basement, those letters trembling in my lap. I finally saw the truth of it. I wasn't simply Abner's third wife. I was his third potential victim. The man I had married to save my family from ruin was not just cruel, not just paranoid, he was a murderer, practiced and patient. He had broken Genevieve with accusations until her body gave out beneath the strain. And Margaret had found a love that threatened him, and for that she had been silenced forever. And now it was me. The truth was unfolding before me, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The pattern was clear now, chillingly clear. Edward didn't just punish his wives for imagined betrayals. He erased them. He silenced Margaret when her heart dared to love another. He broke Genevieve slowly until madness claimed her. And now, it was my turn. His third wife, his third experiment in cruelty, his third possible victim. Can you imagine my friends living in a house where every breath feels like a gamble? Tell me in the comments, what would you do if the person lying beside you each night was also the person you feared most in the world? I tried to live as though nothing had changed. When Edward brushed my cheek with those pale fingers, I forced myself not to recoil. Those same hands I knew had likely pressed a pillow against Margaret's face, or perhaps poured something bitter into her tea. When he smiled and said I reminded him of his previous wives, I nodded politely when all I wanted to do was scream. Of course I do. That's why you chose me. Because we were all the same to you, interchangeable, replaceable, disposable. But secrets like this, weigh more than stone. My body betrayed me before my voice ever could. I grew thin clothes, hanging like rags from a frame, too fragile to carry the burden I carried. My hands shook when I poured Edward's coffee, the porcelain rattling like a death knell. Nights brought no relief, only dreams of endless corridors and footsteps chasing me closer, closer until I woke, gasping. The breaking point came on an ordinary afternoon. I was dusting Edward's study when I noticed something unusual. His desk drawer left ajar. Not the locked bottom drawer where Genevieve had once whispered he hid her photograph. No. This was the middle drawer, filled with business correspondence. And there, resting atop a pile of bank papers, was an envelope, addressed to Dr. Harrison. The handwriting was Edward's, precise and cold, every loop of ink filled with menace. The letter was already open, almost as if it wanted to be found. Against every instinct screaming at me to stop, I slid the paper free and began to read. And what I read turned my blood to ice. It was a request for a medical consultation. Edward had described his wife, me, in chilling detail: paranoid behavior, weight loss, nervous tremors, difficulty sleeping. He called it hysteria. He asked about treatments, about the possibility of commitment, the state asylum. The letter was dated 2 days ago, which meant the decision had already been made. Edward wasn't planning to kill me like Margaret. He wasn't going to torture me into despair like Genevieve. No, this time he had devised something far more cruel, far more permanent. He was going to declare me insane, lock me away where no one would ever believe my words again. Tell me, dear viewers, do you feel the weight of that? Imagine holding the truth in your hands, letters, diaries, evidence of murder, and knowing that if you spoke, the world would dismiss it as the ravings of a lunatic. That's the trap Edward built for me. That was his genius, because who would believe me? The town adored him, the respectable landowner, so dignified, so steady, who had already suffered the tragic loss of 2 wives. And now imagine their sympathy, his poor 3rd wife unraveling under the strain. How heartbreaking, they would say. How noble of him to seek help for her. Standing in his study, clutching that letter with trembling hands, I realized something I had refused to face until that moment. I was completely, utterly alone. The women at church, the ones who whispered about Jonathan's appetites, could never imagine the truth. To them, he was just a man cursed with terrible luck, losing one unstable wife after another. They pitied him. But as I folded that letter and placed it back in the drawer exactly as I had found it, one thought rang in my mind like a church bell. If Jonathan thought he could have me declared insane and locked away, he just made the biggest mistake of his life. Because unlike his previous wives, I knew exactly what kind of monster I was married to. And this time I still had a chance to fight back. That night, I lay awake beside him, listening to his steady breathing, planning my escape, with the desperation of a woman who knows her life depends on every detail. I had a week, maybe less, before Dr. Harrison signed the papers that would erase me from the world. After that, I'd vanish into the asylum, forgotten like smoke. But escaping wasn't enough. I needed to disappear completely to make sure Jonathan could never drag me back. I needed money. I needed transportation. And most of all, I needed evidence, something so damning that he'd fear me more than I feared him. And then, my chance came. Saturday morning, Jonathan left to check on his tenant farms, an all-day errand across 3 counties. I watched from the window until his black Ford disappeared down the road. Then I ran upstairs, scissors trembling in my hand. Breaking into that desk drawer was the most terrifying thing I'd ever done. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the scissors steady. Every creak of the house made me freeze, certain he'd come storming back through the door. But then click. The lock gave way. Inside lay horrors I will never forget. A photograph of Genevieve, harmless and smiling at a train station, defaced with Jonathan's furious scrawl. Newspaper clippings of tragic accidents, Margaret Sarah, even a young woman named Ruth, who had died at just 19. But it was the leather journal hidden in the back that chilled me to the bone. His diary? Jonathan's own hand, page after page, detailing his suspicions, his jealousies, his plans. How he smothered Margaret with a pillow practicing grief in the mirror before calling the doctor. How he staged Ruth's accident. How every wife's death was justice in his twisted mind. And then the entry about me, written just 3 days ago. Elizabeth is showing signs of weakness. She snoops, she asks questions. The asylum will be a mercy compared to what she truly deserves. Friends, can you imagine what I felt reading those words? Married to a man everyone saw as patient, kind of victim. And yet in his own hand, a confession to 4 murders. If I could get this journal to the authorities, Jonathan Finch would hang. But as I sat there, the sound reached me, the distant rumble of his Ford turning back up the road. He was home early, and I was sitting in his study surrounded by his darkest secrets. The rumble of that Ford's engine rolled closer, and terror shot through my veins like ice water. 2 minutes, maybe less, before Jonathan Finch stepped through the front door. And there I was caught in his study, his murder diary burning in my hands, the drawer splintered open like a wound. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like stone. Somehow, I forced myself to shove the journal inside my dress, grab Genevieve's photograph and Margaret's letters, and fumble with the broken lock, desperate to hide what I'd done. Then clang. The scissors slipped from my trembling hands, clattering against the hardwood floor, just as his footsteps thudded on the porch. My heart nearly stopped. The door creaked open. His voice floated through the hall, calm, polite, terrifying. Elizabeth. I stood at the window, watering a plant that didn't need watering, trying to look casual. But when he appeared in the doorway, still wearing his coat and hat, his eyes went straight to the desk, then to me. And I knew, he knew. He didn't yell. That would have been less frightening. No, Jonathan simply studied me, like I was an insect pinned beneath glass. Slowly, carefully, he removed his hat. His coat hung them on the rack. Every move precise, every move controlled. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. Too soft. "What were you doing in my study, Elizabeth?" I whispered something about dusting, about knocking things over. My voice cracked like thin glass. The journal pressed hard against my ribs. as if it had a heartbeat of its own. He examined the drawer, the broken lock, then turned to me with an expression colder than winter itself. His hand touched my cheek, gentle, almost tender, but I knew what those hands had done. And then his mask cracked. The rage came flooding through. Jonathan seized my shoulders, his grip brutal, bruising. His eyes burned with fury as he hissed that he knew exactly what I'd found, knew I'd read it all. But it didn't matter, he said. Nobody would ever believe me. He painted a picture of my future with chilling precision, committed to the asylum, locked in a padded room, my cries of murder dismissed as the ramblings of a madwoman. He even described the treatments, his lips curling, as if the thought of me, broken and silenced, pleased him. But as he spoke, something shifted inside me. Maybe it was the weight of his journal pressed against my heart. Proof, evidence, the words of a monster written in his own hand. Maybe it was thinking of Margaret Genevieve Ruth, all the women who hadn't fought back. Or maybe I had finally reached the moment where anger burned hotter than fear. I lifted my head, met those pale, pitiless eyes, and my voice was steady when I spoke. I know exactly what you are, Jonathan, and the world is going to know too. I have your journal, your confessions, every word. You'll never bury me the way you buried them. For the first time, it wasn't me who trembled. It was him, the look on his face that night. I will never forget it. Pure shock, like he couldn't believe that one of his victims had finally found the courage to stand against him. But that shock lasted only seconds before turning into something much darker. In that moment, I realized whatever happened next would decide whether I lived to see another sunrise or became the fifth name in his diary of destruction. Abner Finch's face twisted, as if a mask had slipped away, revealing something inhuman beneath. And instead of lunging at me like I expected, he laughed. A cold, hollow laugh that chilled me deeper than any anger could. That's when he told me a truth that shattered everything I thought I knew. Yes, he had lured women. Yes, Margaret and Genevieve and the others had vanished because of him. But I was wrong about the most crucial detail. Abner had never killed them. He wasn't the executioner. He was the recruiter. From a hidden drawer, he pulled out a black leather journal. Its pages were not in his hand, but in the precise, educated script of Dr. Harrison, the town's respected physician. Harrison was not just a doctor. He was the monster behind the curtain. And the asylum, it wasn't a hospital for troubled wives. It was a graveyard for the living. Women were taken there, drugged, silenced, and erased from the world. Their deaths staged as suicides, their bodies buried without names. And the most terrifying part, Margaret Genevieve and the others weren't dead at all. They were still alive ghosts in human form, kept in a private ward, forgotten, waiting for death to claim them slowly. That revelation nearly broke me. But in the same breath, it gave me something I hadn't had before: hope. If they were alive, then I could save them. So I made a choice that changed everything. Instead of fighting, instead of running, I looked Abner in the eye and told him I would cooperate. That I would go quietly to the asylum if he let me write one final letter. He believed me. But that letter wasn't a farewell, it was a confession. My confession of his crimes, of Dr. Harrison's hidden prison, of the women who still lived. I gave it to Clara Whitman at church, wrapped as if it were my will, and begged her to send it if anything happened. Clara may have been a gossip, but she was no fool. Days later, when Abner tried to have me committed, the authorities were already on their way. What they uncovered was worse than I imagined. Dozens of women. Not just 5. Lives stolen, families, deceived futures erased. Dr. Harrison was sentenced to the electric chair. Abner received life in prison, and I received something I never thought I'd feel again: freedom. But freedom is not the same as peace. Healing takes years. Nightmares linger. Yet, with Margaret and Genevieve by my side, I learned that survival itself is victory. That being broken does not mean being finished. Now I'm 81 years old. 60 years have passed. And still I carry this truth. Women are stronger than the monsters who try to destroy them. If you are listening tonight and you feel trapped in your own nightmare, I want you to remember there is always a way out. Do not let anyone convince you that you are crazy for seeing the truth. Do not let fear silence you. I am still here. I am still fighting. And so are Margaret Genevieve and the countless others whose voices were almost stolen forever. Tell me, my dear listener, where are you watching from tonight? Write your city in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels. And if this story touched your heart, please subscribe to Love and Tears. Because here, no story is forgotten. Here, we remember. And together, we give every survivor a voice that can never be silenced again.